Welcome to Your College Bound Kid,
a podcast for parents, college counselors, students, and anyone who wants a weekly deep dive into the world of college admissions.
Hi, this is Andy Stricker. I am currently the Dean of Admission and Financial Aid at Connecticut College, located in New London, Connecticut. I've also worked in athletics and admissions at Kalamazoo College, Beloit College, Sinus College, and Guilford College in Greensboro, North Carolina.
I'm Lisa, and I'm a clinical psychologist and college counselor. I have a daughter in college, a daughter in high school, and a son in middle school. After 30 years in Chicago, we recently moved to North Carolina.
My name is Mark. I'm a college coach in Atlanta and the parent of two daughters. Karis, a graduate of Davidson College, and she is the founder of the Spanish tutoring company, SpanishHelpToday.com. And Joy is a wellness coach at the Keenan Flagner Business School at the University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill. And I'm so blessed to be able to work alongside both my beautiful daughters at School Match for You, a college counseling firm that I founded in 2010. This week in the news, the final part of Andy Stricker's interview, all things athletics and recruiting and admissions. And then for our question from the listener, our roundtable is back. This time it's Vince and Susan and Hillary, and we're taking a question from a listener about which AP scores should you report. It's part 3 of 5 of the deep 2-hour dive with David Graves on all things the University of Georgia. And because both our interview and our spotlight are both on a college, the interview is the spotlight, and the spotlight is the interview.
And now it's time for Hot Topics in the News.
Friends, in the final part of Andy Stricker's interview on all things athletic recruiting, Andy answers the question, is it unethical to not share your ED commitment you made to other schools? Andy tells us an incredible story about a football player at Kalamazoo College and what they did to learn more about their coaches before they made an ED commitment. Andy talks about what the merit pre-read is and how it differs from an athletic pre-read. Andy talks about how he brought merit money to Connecticut College, and he talks about how it's profoundly changed their institution and in which ways. And finally, Andy tells us about the joy of the work and why it makes all the challenges worth it. Listen, enjoy this final part in our first ever 7-part interview with Andy Stricker. What advice would you give your kid to schools, let's say 2 and 3 on their list? Let's say it looks like, let's just say that it looks like they're not going to get their number 1.
Yep.
But it looks like they're getting thumbs up from their number 2. But there's a 3 and 4 out there that are expressing a lot of interest in them. What advice would you give them in terms of communicating with those other schools? Like, how much should they, quote unquote, keep those schools warm in case something falls through versus communicate with them, I'm headed in another direction? Like, what advice would you give your own kid on that? Is my question making sense?
No, you're absolutely making sense. And I would say this. I tell families and I tell folks who come through this office all the time, like, listen, if I had to do over again, I'd still go to Earlham College. It was the perfect place for me at the perfect time.
I love it every time you say that, by the way, because I'm all about fit and match. I scream it from the mountaintop. And when I hear people say things like that, it just warms my heart up. You can't, obviously there's more selective schools than Earlham that you probably could have got into, but it's not all about selectivity. You can't say harder to get in equals better.
Exactly.
It frustrates me.
And the moment when the funny thing is you didn't actually push submit on the application at that point in time because it wasn't online. But the day I signed that application and sent it in, I applied to 7 schools. Earlham was a dead last, 7th out of 7. I had no intention of going there. I applied there for one reason, to be nice to my aunt, because she had gone there and she had them send me some stuff. I had Carleton was my first choice. What the heck did I know? Because, by the way, I am not nearly tough enough to run in the winter at Carleton College.
That winter that's a different level of
It's a
winter.
different level of tough. And it would
The
have been an
listeners,
awful.
Carlton's just outside, about a half an hour from Minneapolis. You're talking Minnesota,
Yeah. I mean,
upper Midwest.
I'm too much of a wimp to run in Minnesota in the winter. So my point is that, like, if I was talking to my student and you think you have option number one, and then and then option number three, you have to keep an open mind. Because here's the deal, like, option number one, the coach may leave.
Sure.
And how much do we really know about ourselves in the summer before our senior year of high school?
And I get keeping an open mind. I'm talking about communicating with the schools to keep them warm, sort of as an insurance policy.
I think you want to have an open mind and be receptive to every conversation and every opportunity. Because you never know, school number 3 or 4, you're talking to the coach over the summer and you don't know if it's the right one. It's like 3 or 4 on the list. And then in the fall of your senior year, you decide to go there and do an overnight. And you all of a sudden, it hits you like a freight train. You're like, wow, these are my people. This is the program where I feel I could best develop as a student and as an athlete. If you've already burned that bridge, it's not on the table anymore. So I think having an open mind, plus nothing is a certainty until you get that offer of admission in an early decision letter. I think you want to be transparent, like, hey, coach, so-and-so, by the way, Middlebury made me an offer. I've agreed to apply early decision 1 to Middlebury. I really appreciate your interest. But until that letter arrives in December, nothing's really set and final. I mean, you want to be transparent, but so I think you got to keep your options open. I think you want to be transparent, like, hey, by the way, I did get an offer at Middlebury. I'm considering it. When you decide to, quote unquote, accept the offer from Middlebury, I think you want to be transparent with other coaches. I think you want to be gracious and appreciative. But until it's set in stone, keep your options open. Be transparent, but also be open-minded and willing to hear what other folks have to say.
So transparency would involve letting other schools know that you've accepted an early decision offer, or that you're planning on applying ED. Do you think transparency warrants that? Would it be unethical for a recruit to not tell another school that this school's encouraging me to apply ED and I'm going to go for it? Do you think withholding that crosses an ethical line on the part of a student? Did that make sense?
It does make sense.
You're thinking.
I'm thinking. I don't think that's a binary yes or no.
Tell me when it would be okay to do that. Fear that it might fall through.
So I think this is a moment where young folks need to start developing their own sort of ethical set of beliefs.
Mm-hmm.
Personally, 100% of the time, I would communicate that to the other schools recruiting me. I tend to believe in greater levels of transparency rather than less levels of transparency, because I think it builds trust and it builds authenticity. I have a hard time getting all the way to the point where I would say not communicating that as 100% unethical.
Right. Yeah. I always appreciate anybody that unpacks the gray in this world of admissions.
Yeah. Really For me, 100% I'd be like, Coach, I really appreciate your interest. You know, Middlebury gave me an offer. I'm going to take it. I'm going to apply ED1 there. You know, I wish you and your program the best. I hope you guys win every game except when you play us. You know, I hope we beat your brains in, you know, that kind of stuff. That's how I personally would go about it.
But it sounds like what I'm hearing you say is if there was a student, and let's say I am so nervous about telling people because I've heard about people doing this and not having anything, and I'm not sleeping well, I'm just not comfortable with it, then kind of follow your conscience is kind of what I'm hearing you say.
Yep.
Yeah.
And here's an interesting story. I was working at Kalamazoo, and we had a running back who was from Kalamazoo, Michigan, who was looking at two schools in our conference, us and another institution. And this is really an interesting maneuver this young man pulled. And he called our coach and said, Coach, I need to let you know that I'm going to commit to this other school, which is one of our rivals. And our coach said, I'm really sorry to hear that. You're a great kid. I wish you the best of luck. I hope you have a great career, except when you play us. You know, it's been a real pleasure getting to know you. And the same day he called the other institution and he said, Coach, I need to let you know that I'm committing to Kalamazoo to play football. And the other coach was like, oh, that's the worst decision. They're a joke. There's, you know, what are you doing? And that's what caused the kid to commit to Kalamazoo.
Wow.
Because he was testing. He wanted to see the character of the programs that he was talking to.
Wow.
And he called both schools and said, I'm going to the other one just to see what their reaction would be.
That kid in some ways was wise beyond his years.
Exactly. And our coach, to his credit, was like, you know, I mean, I'm really sorry because you're an awesome kid and I'd love to coach you. We wish you the best, except when you play us.
Yeah.
And this dude was a beast.
Yeah.
It was awesome watching him, you know, steamroll guys for like 4 years.
You got him.
We got him. But, you know, so, I mean, every student needs, and, you know, we're also talking about young folks who are navigating the transition from adolescence to adulthood.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what we're trying to do as high school seniors and on college campuses is helping these young folks navigate that transition. And this is one of these processes which allows a student to explore and develop their own set of ethics and morals. I can tell you how I would do it, but, you know, I have a hard time drawing a hard and fast binary ethical versus unethical there.
Andy, talk about the merit pre-read, because the merit pre-read is different from the athletic pre-read, right? Like sometimes school students will work with will say, okay, make sure you go through with the merit pre-read. Talk to our listeners and tell them what the merit pre-read is.
So for us, you know, the process would orchestrate itself in this fashion. We're going to do an academic pre-read. We're going to get some kind of feedback, whether it's a green light or yellow light. And we're going to move forward. The coach or the athletic program is going to extend an offer. The student athlete is really serious about that offer, but feels uncertain about cutting off other options and making a commitment to a single institution, which would be us, via an early decision / binding application until they get a sense as to what the financials are going to be. So this time of year, my director of financial aid and myself and my athletic liaisons are neck deep in assisting families in financial pre-reads to understand, okay, what are the finances going to be when you apply ED1? So we'll do financial and merit pre-reads for any student who's interested in applying early decision to Con. And that would mean fill out the net price calculator, get the appropriate tax year information, have a conversation with our financial aid office to make sure that the projected EFC is pretty accurate. And if we're looking at a family that's not going to qualify for need-based aid or is relatively low need, let's do a merit estimate so you can get a sense as to what it's going to look like come December 10th or 15th or whenever we release ED1, and therefore there are no surprises. I would rather have that conversation now in July and August than have an upset family in December who had some vastly unrealistic expectations about financial aid and gets upset because they've cut off coach X, Y, and Z without really understanding what the bottom line is going to be with us. So we do that all the time in the summer.
Yeah, and I guess I should let our listeners know for the schools, of which most of the schools in the NESCAC exclusively do need-based, there's not going to be a merit pre-read for some schools. I should throw that out there and rather create the expectation that this applies to everybody. You were at Concord College before they did merit, right?
Yes, I was the guy who instituted merit here.
And understand why you would do that.
Yeah, in the summer of 2016, I believe, or 2017.
And has it helped with yield? Have you seen it help with yield?
it's helped with yield, but it's also helped sort of even out our enrollment funnel. Historically, we'd enroll a significant number of super affluent and students who qualify for significant amounts of financial aid. The middle class have been missing from our enrollment funnel, and it's helped bring that back. So it's evened out the socioeconomics of our enrollment funnel pretty successfully.
Nice.
Yep.
Andy, before we wrap up today, anything we haven't talked about athletics, athletic recruiting, pre-reads you want to leave our listeners with?
I mean, the one other piece I'd throw out there is, one of the real joys is doing the pre-reads, working with families through the process, and then on a day like yesterday, walking around campus and seeing these students here.
Sure.
So we had move-in day yesterday, and, I actually came in early with my dog this morning because the next couple of days our soccer teams start practicing in the morning before orientation activities. So the real joy of this is seeing these students here on our campus participating in the sports that they love. That's why we go through all of these dialogues and conversations over the course of the summer and do hundreds of pre-reads. So we get the opportunity to walk around on a day like yesterday and just high five great kids and say, hey, we can't wait to watch you play for the next 4 years.
Yeah, you're bringing back memories. Move-in day was my favorite day.
I love move-in day.
And what you said transcends athletes too, right? It's that superstar, incredible kid. And nobody around knows the story of how that kid got there and all the twists and turns and the roller coaster ride and all that was involved. And now they're here and you're so excited about the impact they're going to have. And you see two people walking together and laughing and friendships. And that's what makes the work so fun and so rewarding. Awesome.
I just got an email, I think on Tuesday, from a young lady named Brielle Blood, who just graduated from here. Not an athlete, just phenomenal superstar theater performer. Saw her on stage a ton of times, worked as a senior fellow in the office. She's like, hey, Andy, I'm applying for these 2 jobs. Would you be willing to be a reference for me? And I'm like, dude, don't even insult me by asking that question. Of course I would.
I said that to somebody the other day.
Yeah, exactly. Like, hey, listen, just give them my cell phone number and tell them to call me, okay? And I'll be very polite about giving them the you're an idiot if you don't hire this person phone call conversation. You know what I'm talking about.
Sure. Andy, this has been tremendous. Thank you so much for your generosity, your time. To give your time up like this a day after moving day. I'm humbled by it. We'll have you back in a few months, and I'm thinking about maybe talking with you about maybe going back looking at ED2 versus ED1.
Sure,
we've had that conversation before, but we get a lot of questions about it. I think you'd give some good transparency on that. So look to hear from me in a couple months. We'll make it work. Okay. Now we need to hang on for a couple of minutes so you can upload the files and stuff like that. Yeah. And I'll also, hopefully I'll catch you at NACAC in LA too. 100%, dude. I'll be there.
And now it's time for a question from one of our listeners.
Friends, I'm thrilled. I'm here with 3 amigos, not 4. Julia had a conflict, but I'm here with Vince, Susan, and Hillary. Welcome back for our roundtable.
Woo! Hello.
Yeah. Hi, Mark.
Hi. So we're doing a little different this time. We've done it on activities section of the Common App. We've done it on honors section. This time we're doing QFLs and just getting multiple perspective on QFLs. So we'll play the first question from a listener. So we have a very detailed question about whether to submit 4s on APs and only 5s for highly competitive schools. And there's some other components to the question as well.
Hi, Mark and team. Thanks so much for all of the amazing content you share and for answering questions from your audience. My question is about which AP scores to report to help with admissions, particularly for the most competitive schools. I've heard former admissions officers who seem reputable give different answers to this question. Some say that at the most competitive schools, you should only report a score of a 5. And if there are some AP classes that are on your transcript for which you don't report a score, that is okay. Admissions officers will not assume anything since they don't know why a score is not there. Others seem to think that only reporting some scores for AP classes taken will raise red flags about the missing scores. I've learned from you that things are always context dependent. So in my child's case, their school does not require students to take the AP test if they are in an AP class, and this is stated on the school profile. My child is interested in studying math and has 5s in Calc BC, Statistics, and Computer Science A. They also have a 5 in AP History. Things get trickier about what to report with their 4 in AP English Language. They also have scores in AP Physics C, both mechanics and E&M, that they don't want to report at all. They had a revolving door of teachers in this class and don't want to draw extra attention to this by explaining it in the additional information section. They'd prefer to just not report the scores at all. 3 of their 5s were earned in freshman and sophomore year, and only 1 5 was from junior year. Lang and physics were also from junior year. Should my child just report the 5s for the most competitive schools on their list? For less competitive schools, maybe the ones that offer college credit for a score of 4, would adding their Lang score help for admissions? Finally, should they worry at all about admissions officers wondering about the missing scores in Lang and physics, especially since these were in junior year and only 1 5 was earned in junior year? Thanks so much for your help. I really appreciate your guidance and all of the wonderful content you offer.
Vince, going to kick us off with your initial thoughts on this.
Yes. Great question. Very thorough. I think you want to think about a couple of things, major choices. But I will say, if you have scores of 5 and 4, you need to report it. Like that, nobody. I have students at Stanford, at Brown, Princeton, with MIT with 4s and 5s for sure. So I think, yeah, like I could see some questions about, that 2 and bio, what do you do with that? It depends. I would say it depends on who's running the office. If there's going to be these machinations about why it's not there, like you can, I'm not going to say a name, but there is a school, like, whenever they come out with an announcement from the Ivy League, you can tell this person is suspect of everything everyone is doing behind the scenes. But I was taught, and I had to really root this into my head when I read for the University of California, we can't assume what is not there. It was so clear. Do not assume, that they were reading under a street lamp and they had no electricity. If it didn't say it, you can't assume they got a 2. So, so the answer to the question, I think you can think about what to do with scores 3, 2, and 1, but 4s and 5s, please report.
Vince has to go. Thank you, Vince. We can, Hillary, Susan, and I will continue on for a little. Thank you, Vince.
I think it's especially interesting with this particular student because they're clearly very interested in math, and they still got a 4 on AP Lang. Like that's compelling to me.
Right.
I love to see a student who's well-rounded like that, and I don't know anyone who wouldn't want to. If you are a math person and you're getting a 4 on AP Lang, I think that's fantastic, and you need to report that.
Yeah, I agree for the most part with Vince. Like, highly selective schools report your 5s and 4s. Definitely don't report your 1s and 2s. And 3s, the most competitive schools, they're not impressed with 3s. Some highly selective publics are. I once had a conversation when I was at Stanford for a week for training. I asked them about a very specific student I had who was in the top 3% of her class and had a whole bunch of 3s, and they said, don't report them here. So the most selective schools, 4s and 5s, it's a tricky question because when I interviewed 2 MIT admission officers, they said, it is not going to be in your best interest not to report your AP scores. It is just not. For us, you'd be better off reporting them and giving the context why they're lower. So that's that view. And Yale told me that if it's a highly resourced school, they will sometimes follow up with the student to say, hey, we didn't see your AP scores here. They won't assume, because they even told me Sometimes kids literally just forgot. Sometimes they said, well, I looked it up and I wasn't going to get credit. And then now they've gone to this test flexible. If you're reporting your APs, you have to report all of them. But the clear implication from Yale was that, it wasn't just we don't judge. But then I do hear from most schools that what Vince said, that he was trained at California. How do we know grandma didn't die? I literally, I mentioned this to you guys earlier. I was at UCSD today. And so this conversation came up a lot. I wanted to know how AP scores were looked at UCSD, because of course they're, pick your term, test blind, score free, test free, right? So they're not seeing SAT or ACTs, and how APs come into play. They do like APs scores. And they even gave an example, like if you see a student, they have all fives, like that's impressive. So I can see where the question's coming from, because when I look at the students that I've worked with that are at the most competitive schools, and I mean the most competitive, I'm talking about Harvard, Yale, Princeton, Stanford, MIT, Caltech, Duke, Brown. They do have more fives than fours normally. But a 4 is not a bad score. But they normally do. 5 is the most common score that they typically have. So I can understand why somebody would wonder that. But in this case, I mean, this is a math-oriented person who's getting 5s in all of the math-centric type scores. I think it's a no-brainer, and those are my thoughts. Susan, anything you want to add?
Well, a few things. For one thing, AP scores are not admissions tests. Let's put it that way. APs are not validated. They are not reliable. We don't know anything about the statistical significance of AP scores and college success. What we do know is the alignment with highly resourced schools. So a student at a low resource school who gets 3s on her APs may be the highest in her school. I think, Mark, I've told you the story about a student I worked with quite a few years ago who went to an Ivy League school, from a very, very under-resourced family in school. She was the first person in her high school to earn a 3. No one had ever earned. Now, that's a reflection of the quality of the teaching and the access to resources. But, that's something that colleges often forget pretty quickly, that first of all, these are not admissions tests. They have no predictive validity, right? What they have been shown is to align very, very strongly with the wealth of the school and the resources of the family. So, at our private school where you and I worked together for many years, I felt very strongly that the value in an AP class was in the learning and not in the test result. So we said that in the school profile. I stood on that confidently and said, you're not going to see scores from a lot of our kids because they actually don't have to take the test. I don't tell them that they have to take the test. If they want to take the class for the challenge, then that era, that ship kind of sailed, because well-resourced schools started offering coursework beyond the AP level. And AP in well-resourced schools was no longer really seen as the capstone of the curriculum. And it does mark the highest level at schools that are not as highly resourced. So I don't diss the AP program entirely. I just hope that colleges always keep that in mind, that when a school chooses either to not require the AP exam or actually even takes the AP copyright off of the name of a class, it's because of educational value and a very careful look at that. And, our school continued to let kids take APs, but a lot of highly resourced schools have stopped it altogether. They don't offer them at the school. They want the colleges to judge the kids on the educational value of their curriculum. But I'll stop now because it's a high horse that I tend to get on. But for our caller, I support, kids not reporting all of their AP scores. You only have to watch out for the test flexible schools, where if there were more of those before the pandemic, but if some schools come back to saying, we want some group of scores, some constellation of test scores, then if you're going to go with APs, you're going to have to pay attention to the distribution of those subjects and the scores. That may change your mind about whether or not your kids are going to take those tests.
And I would not hesitate to ask a school, how do you feel about not submitting AP? I mean, this is one of the favorite questions I like to ask people in an interview when I interviewing, especially these highly selectives. And I've gotten different answers from them. So I can understand why, this question can, arises, because you will get different answers from different schools. Now, one thing that I will say you get consistently, though, is that the grade in that AP class matters more to people than the score. People will consistently tell you that. I also hear, though, that a student gets a 5 and maybe they have an 84. That shows a certain amount of subject mastery, and that may lead people to think maybe the teacher's a hard grader, especially if there's not a large school group and you don't have ability to suss it out. Hillary, what are your thoughts? You can speak to this because you're reading. See, AP is still extremely common. I hear your point, Susan, and I love that you're always an advocate out there, but it is really common to see AP tests and AP scores.
Absolutely. And in my reading experience, it is a benchmark that is easy to use. And when you hit a school with an independent curriculum, it takes a different kind of reading. And Hillary, I'm sure you run into that all the time.
Oh my gosh. Yeah. I have a special place in my heart for those schools because I sent my kids to a school that had an independent curriculum. And so I really work hard to read those files well because they're harder, much harder to read than an AP file. Mark, talking about the student who has a high AP score and a low grade, I had a student like that in committee once who had actually gotten a C in, I forget which AP physics class, but it was an AP physics class, but then they got a 5 on the exam. And there was no explanation anywhere in the file for why that happened. But, and so I tried not to make any assumptions, but I also gave that student grace that I don't know what happened in that class, if they maybe had an injury that kept them out of class and so they couldn't turn in an important assignment and maybe their teacher didn't work with them, or maybe the student's not a great communicator and didn't communicate that to the teacher. I have no idea. But clearly, if you're getting a 5 on an AP physics exam, you've figured out the material, right? So that was compelling to me for that when I was advocating for that student. I think that other thing that I don't know if a lot of parents or students know this, but you don't get credit for your AP classes by submitting them in the admission process. Those may then get turned over to the registrar to become credit, but if you don't submit them in the admission process, you can always go back and submit them later on to the registrar. If you want, say you have a 3 in something that's going to give you some credit, but you don't want to submit it during the admission process, that's totally fine. You can still submit that score later and get some kind of credit if your college offers credit for it. At CC, we don't really, I probably look more at AP scores than anyone else does, just because I think it's interesting to see how a student's scores line up with their grades. But I read with a lot of reading partners who sort of just flip through that because it's not a part of our evaluation that is measured, right? We're not scoring those. We're not adding it to the student's academic rating. And so it's not a part that we really care a lot about. It's sort of one of those things that when you see it, if you notice it, it could either raise your eyebrows ooh, they got a 1 on that exam, which students sometimes submit those, or wow, great, look at that. They've got 12 5s in a row. That's really incredible. But usually if you see 12 5s in a row, you also see straight A's in really hard classes, right? So it's not it's not adding a lot of information, at least for us in our evaluation.
I have a theory on that, and I can never prove it. I don't think I'll ever be able to prove it, but obviously nobody sees senior year APs, right? They're coming out in July. So I think that's one of the things that diminishes the score value is the whole entire senior curriculum. You're not even be able to see how somebody got on a score. And so I think Now, that doesn't mean like strong scores in 10th and 11th don't catch your attention, and super low scores don't catch your attention in another way. Because that can also be an indication, right? Like this stuff is so context dependent, because Susan is so correct. And if Julia was on here today, I know she would talk about this, because she has shared a lot of times in reading Los Angeles and some of the underrepresented areas where it was very, very, very unusual to see scores other than 1 or 2. And so that context would be considered.
Yeah, but I see that on the landscape tool every year now that we're reading with landscape, because you get that information.
Yep.
Yeah.
It's so helpful to have that. Landscape.
You guys read with landscape? Do you read with landscape, Hillary?
Yeah, I love landscape. Love it, love it, love it.
What is it that you love about landscape? We've had some.
It's just, you don't have to spend. I mean, I feel like I'm really harping on how long it takes to read today, and I don't mean to do that, but it just gives you such a quick picture of what the student's situation is, right? Mm-hmm. And to be able to see that the school that they go to is under-resourced just by looking at a really quick bar graph it really just helps you understand the context of the student in a really quick way. It's a bit of a shortcut, right? But I find it to be a really helpful shortcut. And when we're in committee, we don't get a lot of time to advocate for a student. So be able to point to landscape and say, look, this student, if they took an exam, right? If they took an SAT, to be able to say, like, this student's 1150 is, well over the 75th percentile for their school. Their 75th percentile for their school is 900. Like, it just is a really fast way to show someone something that otherwise you could do in a very long narrative that you don't have time for. So it's just a nice shortcut.
Yeah, and it's always tricky when we talk about scores, because are they noted? Yeah, I think extremes are. But I don't want I always get concerned with people who have very high scores all of a sudden thinking like they're definitely getting in these highly selective schools. And that's true.
No, that's not true either.
Yeah, that's not true either. I mean, I once had a student that had 12 5s who didn't get in a single Ivy League school. And this was a student that was also really high grades and everything as well. So I think that would shock some people, and I see that a lot with.
Well, it only gets you through the first round of elimination.
Mm-hmm. Right.
You
clear the academic hurdle as somebody who can do the program. Which is awesome. Yes.
But that's an awful lot of the applicant pool at that point. And after that point, it's really about everything else.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I had a listener reach out this week, and he was offended that I had used the term entitled. I said, I see more entitlement with really high test scores than anywhere else. Maybe I was trying to communicate more disillusionment or more. I mean, I understand where that entitlement could come from, because people don't understand the big concept of all of the other schools, and people tend to think they're a big fish in their own pond, and they don't realize what the competition they're up against. But they also tend to think scores count more than they do. And this is true for AP or SAT, especially at highly selectives, right? Like people really, you see it when a student gets a high score, all of a sudden they really think, oh, now I'm getting in, right? They really tend to think that way. And I'm just trying to protect people so they don't feel sucker punched in the gut when they're like, whoa, how did that happen? I got a 1580. This other kid had a 1480 and they got in and I didn't. And if you understand how admissions works, that's not surprising.
Right.
But there's an entitlement that comes, and maybe an entitlement's not the best word, but there's an overinflation of expectations where people unduly put more weight on the testing than I feel is warranted. And you've brought this up many times here, but colleges know how much those scores are correlated to family income and family educational opportunities. And so it's so common for them to see really, really high testing from families that are well-resourced. So that in of itself doesn't really stand out in a highly selective pool as something that's wow, look at this. Can you believe this kid did this? And we're not trying, and the person who reached out said, kids worked really, really hard to get that score. You shouldn't be putting it down. I mean, that's true too, but I just don't want people to think it carries more weight than it does.
Yeah. Also, knowing that the student worked really hard to get that score tells me that that student had time to work hard to get that score, right? Which means that they had some privilege in there. And that's, that might hurt people's feelings, but also it's just sort of goes to what you were just saying, that scores correlate with socioeconomic status. I also think it's have to remember that there's a point of diminishing returns on scores, right? Like for us at CC, we can see that once a student gets to about 1450, you get any higher than that, and it doesn't really point to anything, right? Like it doesn't increase a student's chance of graduation, or it doesn't predict a higher GPA. It doesn't predict any kind of success more out of 1450 or at a 1500 than a 1450 would, right? So like I used to tell students before, when we were more test optional and not, now we're something called no harm testing, right? Where we don't consider test scores that students send in if they're not good. But when we used to be test optional and students had to think harder about whether they were going to send in their scores, I would tell students, like, once you get to a 1450, it's fine. Like, just send your score. Like for me, a 1450 is the same as a 1600. I don't see a difference between those two because it's not telling me any new information. And I just hate to see students, and I know that that's not true for MIT or Stanford, but most schools are not MIT and Stanford. And yet there are still lots of highly selective schools out there. And I just would hate for a student who's aiming for a school with a 15 to 20% admit rate to get a 1450 and say either I can't submit this, or gosh, I need to go study for 20 more hours so that I can get
and spend another $1,000.
Yeah,
well,
like go
you
do
guys are
something
going to
with
think
your
this
life.
is insane.
Don't do that.
But I have been asked this year by 3 kids with 1580s and another kid with a 1570 whether they should take it again.
Oh, that just makes me so sad because there's so many other better things to do on a Saturday morning. Go for a hike.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, we are the only country that thinks this way, which is why it's hard.
I know. It's weird, huh?
It makes it extra hard if you've got communities with parents who were educated in other parts of the world where test scores were, the gateway to everything, to the right university, to the prestige, to the right income corporation. It's the whole concept of diversity and equity and inclusion and holistic evaluation. It's very American.
Well, you brought up something, Hillary. I thought it was really profound. You might almost want to say it again. Remember, you said, what was it? I said that you said it tells me that somebody has time. Can you say that again?
Yeah, if they worked really hard to get that score.
Yes.
Like, isn't that sort of the point, that you're not supposed to have to work hard for it? Like, I mean, I know it's not. That's not how we think about testing. But if you're spending all that time to learn how to take the test better, like, did you learn any information that you can actually use in classes or in real life? Maybe you did. I don't know.
Well,
did you just learn how to take a test?
The thing that caught my attention about that is, and this is nobody's fault, but schools tend to be so segregated by social class. And I think that for families that are more well-resourced, they wouldn't even really know what you're talking about when you say that. But you, because you're reading applications all the time, you know that there's kids that have to work 30 hours a week because they're helping their parents pay the bills. And,
that's right.
You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
And so I thought that was a profound statement that you made, the fact that you have the time, because I think there's another family, and it's not their fault. It's just their experience in the world to be they're coming there. What do you mean I didn't? Of course I have the time. What do you mean I wouldn't have the time? Mm-hmm. But literally, I mean, there are people that don't have the time because of, the mom goes to grab the second job at the Amazon shift and the kid has to take care of the 2 kids and do all those things and do the chores and do, you know what I mean? And so I think that's a really important point. And I
don't want anyone to think I'm a hypocrite. Like I was going back through my calendar yesterday looking for something from 2020. And in June 2020, I see on my calendar for my oldest daughter to be taking a practice ACT. And then the next weekend, practice ACT. And then the next weekend, practice ACT. And I was like, oh, good Lord, what were we doing? But I mean, you do what you feel like you have to do in order to help your kid get where
Right.
they need to go. And also, like, the whole model is broken.
Yeah. And I think that's an important point too. Like, nobody's beating anybody up because you're using whatever resources you have to advance your kid. Like, that's what everybody does. Some people just have more resources than others, but schools that are reading holistically will factor that in at some level. And if you're not really exposed to how life may be on the other side of the tracks, you may not even realize that you're saying things that connote privilege, and you don't even know that they connote privilege because it's kind of the only world that you know.
Right.
Yeah, because it's the water you swim in.
Right. Is the water you swim in. I love that. Yeah. Awesome. So this has been fun. This has been awesome. So, Susan, I was talking with Hillary. Remember how you and I we've been talking about a while, talking about the secondary school report, the school report. Hillary says she'd love to join us. So,
Excellent.
I think the three of us will come back again. We'll put it out to Vince and Julia if they're available, that, they can join in, and let's talk about the secondary school report, because it's something I think people know very little about.
That's right.
Mm-hmm.
Not something they're going to see. I think people know more even about a school profile than they know about the secondary school report, because the school profile may have been shared at a counselor meeting, or maybe it's on the website, especially our listeners. But I think it'd be good to go through the secondary school report, talk about the different questions that are asked on there, talk about how they're interpreted. And so let's get on our calendar. At some point, everybody's busy, but let's do it in the fall. I'd love to join you guys for that. Awesome.
Sounds good.
Thank you.
Awesome. Thanks, guys.
And now this week's interview with a special guest.
Friends, it's part 3 of a 5-part interview I'm doing with David Graves, Director of Admission at University of Georgia, someone who's been at UGA for 27 years. In part 3, David explains why UGA lists the range of the number of APs and IBs classes they are tests that students have in their profile, and he explains why this is not what you think it means. David answers a question from me about whether it's harder to get into UGA if you apply early action, and whether a borderline student would be advised to apply in the regular decision round. David explains the factors that UGA takes into consideration when they do their holistic review of each applicant. David gives some advice for students about the UGA essay. David answers the question, does UGA take into consideration the high school a student is coming from? David talks about how a file is read if a college doesn't have AP or IB classes. David talks about in-state versus out-of-state admissions, and he shares the states where they are experiencing the biggest surge of applicants. David talks about whether a student coming from a very underrepresented state is factored in as a plus factor, or are all out-of-state schools just grouped together. David talks about how transfer admission process works and whether there's a guarantee that you'll get in if you have a certain GPA. Listen and enjoy. I know that you produce a great profile. You get it out earlier than most. It's really nice. Oftentimes I'll see middle 50% has like 9 to 13 classes sort of that are somewhere in that range, or 7 to 12. It's kind of in that range, 7 to 12, 9 to 13, they've done different years, that are classes that students are, seen as rigorous classes when you're looking at that rigor piece.
Yeah.
But how do you account for, like you said, some schools offer way more than others? Is that factored in at all into that assessment, or is it more of we're counting APs and you either have them or you don't?
The reason I give out the number of AP, IB, and dual enrollment classes a student takes is not because we're shooting for that number, but really it's because if I was to tell everybody out there, well, we like the most demanding curriculum, our very hard curriculum, they look for numbers. And there's no one in numbers to give them. But we've had students that we've admitted that might have taken 5 AP or dual enrollment classes, but they challenged themselves in all the core areas within that, and they might have had a little bit more limitations, either because where they are, or some high schools will say, yeah, you can take 1 AP sophomore year, 2 junior, 3 senior. We understand that. And so we're not setting a bar of get this number, but that's the only measuring stick that some people have. And so we just give out that number to try and say, this is not, you don't shoot for the number, shoot for rigorous in all core areas and the best you can. Because I have some students that look at that number and say, all right, how do I get 8 AP classes? I've got 6 that are social studies, and then I'm going to take a math, college algebra, and we don't even teach college algebra. So I never suggest students take that if possible. They shoot for the number, not for the quality and the distribution of over core. So the only reason I give out those numbers is because there has to be some measuring stick that people want. But I caveat that with saying it's not the number. It's how are you taking advantage of all the core areas in your rigor and really preparing yourself for both UGA classes and preparing yourself for your academic area.
All right. I'm going to break all these question asking rules and ask 2 questions at the same time. So I want you to go into what holistic review is, but and I also want to ask a question. I don't know if this is outdated advice or if it's still true, but back in the day, I've had a couple different UGA admission officers say to me that if a student doesn't look like they're in profile with what we talked about, academic review, GPA, rigor, testing, they're probably better not applying early action and applying regular so that they can have some of these other holistic factors taken into consideration. And what they had said to me was, while it's true most of the time if you're close, you'll get deferred, maybe you won't get deferred. And so if you don't have that profile, I'd actually recommend you apply regular. Does that advice still stand true? Or because I'm going back a few years and sometimes things change, but like I said, 2 different admission officers at UGA have told me this, but this would have been 2015, 2018, the last time they said that.
It somewhat still applies, but
because it goes against what people say, which is early action is a lot of times a little bit of an advantage. And I know you're very clear in your system, early action is not an advantage, but that in that system, it's almost like early action may hurt you potentially at UGA if you're out of profile.
Yeah. And it won't hurt you. It's just, you're going to hear a denial decision earlier.
Right.
But yeah, I would say that it somewhat applies that you've got to say, if I'm close in all of those areas, apply. If not, maybe wait. But I never want to get in between a student and a school official or a parent. I'm going to say the student has to make their own choice. And my answer usually, as far as early action regular decision, if you are comfortable with your grades right now at, October 15th, middle of your semester, if you're comfortable with how you've challenged yourself, if you're comfortable with the test scores that you have right now, and if you're comfortable as far as your time commitment, being able to say, I can take some time right now to craft a strong application, apply early action. If you say, I need more time, football's killing me and I don't have the time. Or if you want December test scores, if you want fall grades in before we look at you initially, apply regular decision. Same process, just a different timeline. And if you need a little bit more time or other things, apply regular decision because, again, same process. It used to be a little bit different going back 10 plus years, but now it's the same process. If you are admitted early action, you're going to be admitted regular decision, and the reverse is true. It's just a timing situation. That's all.
So let's talk about holistic review. Because here you are able to take recommendations more into consideration, extracurriculars, writing. I mean, talk about like some of the factors that get weighed for every applicant in the holistic review that may or may not be factored if you're doing academic review.
And one big key I always try and tell students and parents are a big part of this, is that a holistic review still has a lot of the academic parts in it.
Sure.
People sometimes think, that means you're really just looking at everything else. No, academics in a holistic review, it's key. But we also are in a holistic review able to say, let's look a little bit more at grade trends. How have you done freshman through junior, senior year? We're looking to see, are there any oddities as far, oh, well, there's a dip with, here's a C here, but we see that you might have had a challenge, in your family life then.
Extenuating circumstances, things
Yeah,
like
we're
that.
looking at that. We're looking, again, curriculum, there might be 7 APs, but how are they arrayed? Looking a little bit more in depth than that. Then we also have that co-curricular side is what I usually call it, where I'm saying, how have you spent your time outside of the classroom? What are you involved in? I'm writing a blog post right now about depth and saying depth is so much more important than breadth. We still want you to be active in more than one thing, but that's okay to be involved just passionately in one thing. It's not I heard a few other people say, it's not the well-rounded student. Yeah, but I love to see a well-rounded student, but I'm also okay with students who are, who have that triangular shape where it's, I have points that stick out farther because I'm really passionate about dance, or I have a part-time job where it's a passion of mine and I'm spending 30 hours there, or whatever it might be, where we're saying, whatever you do, find something that you feel, one, you enjoy, you love, and do it well and really go in depth, because then we'll be able to translate that to say, how are you going to be on our campus? Are you really going to dive in? With co-curricular, we're also looking at how you interact with others, how you connect with others or give back. So, sometimes that's going to be through the recommendations a little bit. Sometimes that's going to be volunteering, and volunteering starts at home. So yeah, there are some students who are going to say, yeah, I went to, Australia to help with penguins. That's great, but almost nobody can do that. The reality is, I'm saying, how have you taken care of your family, your local community? Are you involved within that? Because we have a lot of great service areas here on campus that we want students to plug into and learn to give back. It's a part of how you grow is to learn about others and
So
connect with others.
co-curricular is factoring in
Yep.
more in holistic review.
You got it.
What about writing, and what
Oh,
about
yeah.
recommendations? Are they factored more in holistic review than academic review?
Yes. So, I mean, in academic review, it's really just, here's the academics. And
Sure.
so you're leaving off. So when I'm looking at a student's, I'll say it's not just writing, but it's also your creativity. So writing and expression and creativity. So I always say the essays are a part of a part of a part. So don't freak out over the essays. We try and make them a little bit shorter so that it's not going to be I've got to craft this and get somebody else to craft it, etc. We're not looking with a red pen. We're saying, I want to know more about you through these essays. And I want to learn more about what you're like as a person. Yeah, it's also how you communicate, how you tell a story. But again, a science major communicates a little bit differently than an English major. An English major is going to have a little bit more flow and, crafting of that just personally, versus, that STEM student might be a little bit more direct in style of writing. So we're not really saying, let's judge your style of writing, but more, what do you communicate and how do you communicate? But again, it's only a part of a part. We're also saying, in that area, how did you express your passion? Again, are you involved in robotics? Are you involved in dance? Are you involved if you're in political science, did you do boys state, girls state? Did you work on a campaign? Things like that, where I have a passion. I'm trying to really dive into it a little bit more. Recommendations, we try and limit the number of recommendations. So it's going to be, you can have the counselor. We have a secondary school report, but then a counselor can add a recommendation. But we know that some schools, a counselor is going to have 300 students or more that they might have to work with. We might not get one because it's just an overwhelming situation. You can also have a teacher that sends in one and a community member, but those are optional because we know that, again, it sometimes is difficult to get a recommendation. And when I'm looking at that, I try and tell recommenders. I sat at a high school about a year and a half ago with all of the teachers saying, here's how I would write a recommendation. I could do a bullet point, say, hey, just give me some details, organize it easier, and I don't need you to regurgitate what the students already told us as far as their activities, their academics. I want to say, here's how they are as a student in the classroom. How are they working with the other students? How are they as far as, respect for teachers and for things? How are they as far as pushing forward and really diving into subjects? Things that I can't see from a simple grade or from an activity. I can say, what is their hard work? Their work ethic. That's really what I'm trying to dive into sometimes with recommendations. But if they don't have a recommendation, I'm not going to hold it against them because I know that's tough.
What about the high school the student's coming from? Does that come into play at all? Are you looking at a school profile and getting a sense of how college prep the culture is? Are you looking at, for in-state kids, you're looking at any of your own data to say, hey, we've got X number of kids from this school, and we kind of know that kids from this school are well prepared? Does that factor in at all?
We used to do that. We do not do that anymore for the last 8+ years. And there's a couple of reasons why we don't. One, almost every student doesn't get to choose where they go to school.
Mm-hmm.
And that's tough to be able to say, hey, I'm going to go to this school no matter what. Even if it's the best school in the state, there's probably 30 schools in the state that feel they're the best school in the state. Or if it's one that has, real limited resources. I don't get to choose that as a student, so I'm not going to hold that against you. But two, it's interesting. We give out for the last probably 7 years or so, we've given out what's called a Director's Cup, which is we look and say, all right, last year's freshman class, how did they do as far as their first year here? And if they have 10 or more students, we say, let's look and see which school had the strongest freshman year GPA. And it's usually not the schools that people will say, oh, U.S. News
Sure.
and World Report, here's the best high schools in the state. It's generally not those. We have, a lot of small rural schools. I remember Winder Barrow, which is near here, which is pretty rural, that I think it was 3 years ago had the best GPA of all high schools as far as their students here freshman year. It was about a 3.8 GPA. And sometimes it's where we say, wow, here are students that might have limitations as far as their situation, but they have done amazing things within what they have been offered and been able to be at their high school. What are they going to be like when they suddenly have the resources of a UGA in their pocket? They're going to do amazing things. So we will look at the high school, look and see what's offered, what activities are available, all that, and trying to understand a student situation. But we don't promote a school or demote a school over another just because of the school profile.
Do you find that leads to some confusion? Because I know on my part, I've had 2 kids I worked with that got in Princeton and not UGA, and other kids Stanford and not UGA, and they were kids that were coming from sort of these northeastern boarding schools where, some of those schools, because I used to send a lot of kids to those and I used to work at one. I mean, I've had kids that were middle school valedictorians that weren't admitted to those places. So some of those places are so selective that people get into them. Now, some of them have a lot of grade inflation as well, but some of them you get in and wow, if you're like in the top 15% of your class, you might be valedictorian at your public school, but I don't know if UGA factors that in. I think that, in fact, I've had some conversations with people at UGA before, and it was more, well, hey, they had every type of advantage that other kids didn't have, so we're not going to turn around and also give them an advantage of, well, they're in a more selective applicant pool and sort of factor that in. Is that kind of the thinking on that, or do you? Because the word on the street is UGA is not necessarily friendly to people that come from these really difficult to get into independent schools where you may not have like a super, super high GPA.
And we try, I mean, the examples you give are probably, very limited examples. I mean, we do have a fair number of students where we admit from very strong schools, both in Georgia and, in we see a lot of boarding schools in North Carolina and Virginia that we admit students from. We don't see as many from the New England area, but I know about them. We're having a rep within probably, I think, 2 weeks going up to New York, Connecticut, and New Jersey. one, I would say we always want to do a better job than we did last year. And we always want to learn a little bit more about those schools, but we also trying to take into account that some of those students, we have to look at their GPA a little bit differently, only because many times they will not have what's designated AP or IB. We'll have to say, let's look at it and say, they have done their own framework. The advanced is the most difficult, and try and recognize that. Again, recognize what the school offers and how they designate it, and try and make our best decision. But at the same time, I'm not going to say, oh, we're going to admit a student just because X, Y, or Z college did it might be a little bit higher, because they might have a little bit different process that they do that others might not feel as comfortable with. As far as they might be saying, well, let's take X or Y into consideration, where I'm not comfortable with that, or I might, it might have been a situation with, with other situations that are limiting as far as what we can do. Again, Ivy Leagues are just a different world, and I try not to compare myself to the Ivy League. It's just a totally different world.
So let's talk about your out-of-state pool taking off like crazy. Because I remember it wasn't that long ago that I used to hear UGA say, we don't look at gender, we don't look at major, we don't look at race, we don't look at legacy, and we don't look at out-of-state. And I think all those things are still true now, except for the out-of-state. It's only been, 2 years since you've gone to this 80-20 since the Common App and winning 2 national championships, and your out-of-state, applicant pool blowing through the roof. So I know Georgia's not a state that has a mandatory imposition of you have to take a certain percentage. But, something Georgia Tech realized a while ago, hey, we know where our bread is buttered and who the state taxpayers are, and we're going to get ahead of it and impose our own. So tell me what those out-of-state numbers look like, because you had to have something to go to a mandatory in-state, out-of-state. Like, where are you seeing real growth in your applicant pool out-of-state?
I think that definitely it's still going to be the East Coast. But we saw real growth in the last couple of years in New York, as far as even though we'd had Virginia high, they have continued to grow. Maryland, North Carolina, Texas is always a big state for us. Mm-hmm. It was funny because it used to be called the Matthew Stafford sort of effect. Even that he was a former quarterback here. He's now about to retire. I mean, so it's not that it's that long ago. Yeah, for a long time. As far as you got it. So he's still out there, and we are excited for him. But that was a while back. Texas has always been massive. Florida, we have a lot of students apply from Florida. They don't always enroll because Florida, Georgia. I mean, similar, and you've suddenly got in-state tuition, but you've just seen it up the East Coast a great deal. California a little bit as far as growth there, and you're always going to see, just because population numbers, California, you're going to see those strong numbers. But I think that really East Coast and maybe a little bit within the central parts of the country, the Rust Belt, you'll see it there, but not as much. But East Coast is if we want to talk out of state, and you said bread and butter, out of state bread and butter is going to be up and down the Eastern Coast. And I think that it's interesting because, again, different students from different states react differently. Students from Maryland and New York, New Jersey, if we admit them, they have a much higher chance of enrolling than a student from Florida. And again, it's just you've got different financial considerations. You've got in-state schools that are similar to us that you're not going to see at Maryland or New York, etc.
Do you take out-of-state diversity into consideration? In other words, some schools will say, oh, we don't get very many people from this state, so that's a kind of diversity component. And then other schools I've talked to just say in-state, out-of-state, that's it, 2 buckets, and we group you all the same if you're out-of-state versus we're looking at states where we don't get that many voices from that area. Do you factor that in at all?
Not really. For the most part, it's just the 2 buckets that you mentioned, in-state, out-of-state, and you can throw internationals in there because internationals we treat the same as out-of-state, and a lot of international students are actually in the United States studying at boarding schools. studying at other institutions. But really, it's two buckets. Now, if you told me that you had a great North Dakota or South Dakota student, I'd be like, I'm jumping on that because we rarely see Dakota students or Montana. But for the most part, it's, hey.
But if I tell you like Illinois or something where you see a fair amount, Illinois is sort of no different than.
It's no different than Tennessee. It is, again, we're looking and saying, what is the school they come from? New Trier High School up in Chicago area is a very different school than some of the other ones we see. It's very different from, Brother Martin in Louisiana as far as size, scope, what they're offering, what abilities they have. And so we try and take that into consideration as far as, again, that school options that they have and what they've done with what they've given. And if a student has a lot of things that are given at their high school and they take advantage of it, that's just amazing. And we love that. And so I don't want people to think, oh, well, my high school has a lot of APs, a lot of activities, so I'm going to be harmed by that. I'm going to say, wow, if you have that and you've taken advantage, that's great. And I really want you, because you have stepped up to the plate, and you'll step up to the plate here at Georgia and take advantage of all the offerings here. And that's great.
Let's talk transfer admission. So you're really clear on your website. You need to have 30 to 59 credit hours completed before you apply and send official transcripts and meet the application deadline. And if you don't have a 3.3 GPA, that's kind of a minimum. I've heard in the past that if you have that GPA, it's a pretty straightforward process. But then I know I was just looking at your blog, and there's a clear statement on there that no GPA guarantees admission for a transfer. So talk to us about how transfer admission works.
No problem. So, and things could change in the future as far as transfer admissions, but
yeah, because you upped the minimum GPA a few years ago. I think it was like, wasn't it 3.2 a while ago and went to 3.3, or 3.3 went to 3.4, something like that.
It went up to the sophomore ones went up, and then this past spring, the junior senior one went up as far as if you have 60 or more hours, we shifted up that minimum consideration level. But probably it was probably 20 years ago. I'm dating myself, and we suddenly had minimum criteria. They said if you hit this, you're in, you're out. Hit it, don't hit it. And then suddenly we had 1 year where there were just a flood of transfer applications, and we were reviewing files. I was in charge of the review process. We're reviewing files at a great clip, doing great. And about April 1, April 2, suddenly it's, oh my gosh, we're getting more freshmen than we think we have, as far as space for. We've got to stop transfer admission as far as offering admission. And so we're about 2/3 of the way done with admitting transfers. And suddenly it was, oh my gosh, we've just got to stop. There were great students we hadn't gotten to yet. They applied a little bit later, 4.0 students, and we had to say, I'm sorry, we can't admit you. And so that was horrible. That's horrible as far as to tell a student, tell a parent. It's horrible for the overall situation. But we, at that point, said, we've got to change our wording and our statement to say, this is a consideration level. But we have to have the flexibility that if we set our deadline, March 1st is the deadline to apply and to get in all documents. We don't make any offers of admission until probably mid to late March, because we want to say, what is the applicant pool like for the transfers? We have to control that, because we are not an institution that can just be like, we're 300, 400 over as far as freshmen. So what? No, housing is going to just go crazy if we did that. Same with transfers. We've got to say, we want to provide you with a good education and get you into classes so you can graduate. We've got to limit the size of the transfer population. And we know that if we admit, 2,000 transfers for fall, we know that 75% of them are going to say yes to us and enroll. We've got to make sure we control that. So that consideration level of, hey, if you've got 30 to 59 hours, minimum consideration, level is going to be a 3.30. If you are 60 or above, it's a 3.0. Those are ones we say we're setting a bar. Most of the time, if you hit that, you're going to be admitted, but I can't guarantee it. And when I say, minimum qualification, that's somewhat of that guarantee you're going to get in. If I say consideration level, it means, hey, we have room, we need wiggle room to make sure that we hit our numbers and don't over enroll. And that's where it is a little bit more simple as far as the process. Hey, get this. But whenever I talk with a transfer student, I say, don't shoot for the minimum consideration level. Shoot for the best you can in your classroom, because that is could have an impact. And if nothing else, it's going to have an impact on how well you do in future classes. But don't say, I'm just going to hit a 3.3 and that's it. No. Challenge yourself, work hard, take the classes that are going to go towards a degree, not hey, I'm just getting in, so let me take art history that I'll never really need. Take whatever. If it's art history and you're an art major, take it. Sure. Take the classes. It is a little bit, again, easier to do, but we want to make sure that we've got breathing room in case we just have too many applicants. That's all.
That makes sense. Friends, this concludes this segment of my interview with David Graves. I hope you'll join us next week for the next section. Friends, I was going to give you an overview of NACAC on episode 470. I like to do that when I go to a major conference like this. I want you to be able to vicariously experience what it is like to be here. Not everybody has the time or the resources to travel to conferences like this. But I want to take a week to process everything. I also want to talk to Vince and Susan and get their input on what they thought stood out at the conference, and come back the following Monday with a NACAC overview. For this Monday, I want to do something that is more lighthearted. I'm recording this right now at 6:30 a.m. The bus leaves from the LA Convention Center where the conference is held for UCLA in an hour and a half. That'll be my 16th visit out of 20 I'm doing on this trip. And what I've been doing is I've been working on creating these categories. I have 20 of them so far. So there are things like most beautiful campuses I visited on this trip, schools where the students seem the most stressed out, colleges with the most school spirit, et cetera, et cetera. And I was going to act like it's the Olympics. So this school gets the gold, and this one gets the silver, and this one gets the bronze. But that was darn near impossible. In some cases, I had a hard time not recognizing 6 schools, and in other cases, I could only shout out 1 school. And keep in mind, and this is really, really, really important, this is just my impression. So don't take it as gospel. But I think it should be fun. It should be a lighthearted episode, and I'm kind of excited about doing the preparation for it and sharing it with you. And then we'll have part 205 with Aaron Wolf, the Director of Financial Aid at Bucknell. And friends, it really warmed my heart when a counselor who is in year 35 in the business wrote in after part 1 of the Aaron Wolf session and said, I've been doing this for decades and I did not know the things that Aaron shared on part 1. Well, we only covered 4 of the reasons why aid awards are all over the place in part 1. The entire interview will cover 17 reasons why aid awards are all over the place. And that's why you listen to Your College Bound Kid, because you like the deep dive. So you'll hear part 2 of 5 on Monday. Friends, I was talking to a friend the other day, and she said, the school my daughter goes to used to be ranked number 3, and now it's number 2. And if you want to say something to me that's like nails on a chalkboard that causes me to flinch reflexively and recoil, tell me where a school is ranked cumulatively. So I responded by saying, I don't believe you can create an overall numerical ranking for a school, because ranked number 2 for who? What is good for one student is not good for another. So I had a big smile on my face the other day when I saw Forbes magazine's rankings and Wall Street Journal's magazine rankings are bouncing all over the place for Babson College. And I love Babson College too, but the reason why I was so excited was I said to myself, snap, this gives me great ammunition to prove how subjective cumulative rankings are and how they'll be all over the place based on the formula, whoever's doing the ranking. So the Wall Street Journal literally moved Babson from number 126 to number 10 in 1 year. And then they moved it to number 2 this year. So here are their top 10 schools for the Wall Street Journal's 2025 rankings. Princeton, number 1. Babson, number 2. Stanford, number 3. Yale, number 4. Claremont McKenna, number 5. MIT, 6. Harvard, 7. Cal Berkeley, 8. Georgia Tech, 9. Davidson, 10. Now, many other rankings would not have Babson or Claremont McKenna or Cal Berkeley or Georgia Tech or Davidson over places like Duke and Penn and Brown and Columbia and Dartmouth, Northwestern, and a bunch of others. I'm just trying to let you see how subjective rankings are. Niche says Babson is 73. And just this year, U.S. News completely retweaked its formula. So here are the top 10 major changes by U.S. News just this year in their rankings. University of Texas, San Antonio moved up 49 spots. NCAT, North Carolina A&T, up 49 spots. Andrews University, 47 spots. Eastern Kentucky, 41 spots. Dominican University, New York, 40 spots. Union University, 40 spots. University of North Texas, 40 spots. Winston-Salem State University, North Carolina, 40 spots. UTEP, 38 spots. Florida Tech, 38 spots. Augusta University in Georgia, 36 spots. Boise State, 36 spots. And Prairie View, 36 spots. The point is this. You're going to go crazy. Literally, your head will be spinning. You'll go bonkers chasing after what some other rating organization regards as prestige, because they're trying to get clicks and sell magazines. So these things keep jiggering all over the place as they tweak their formula every year from one year to the next to get buzz. The point is this: run your own race, stay in your own lane, and don't outsource to someone else what you regard as beautiful. Because remember, college is a match to be made and not a prize to be won. See you on Monday, friends. I'm off to UCLA. And that's our show. A big thank you to you, our listeners, for tuning in this week. If you find this podcast helpful, please follow us and you'll get every single episode as soon as it is released. If you're interested, there are a few ways you can really support our podcast. You can click the share button and send it to your friends and acquaintances. You can help us pay our staff and our expenses by donating on our website. You can write a review for us on Apple or Spotify. I'm the producer of the podcast, but we have a fantastic team of 15. Shout out to our co-host, Dr. Lisa Ruff, Dr. David Williams, Linda Depker, Susan Tree, Vince Garcia, and Julia Esquivel. And to our substitute co-host, Sylvia Borgo. Our sensational sound engineer is Nemanja Motvich. Our amazing music is from Victor Allen Weeks. Marketing designs are from Kimberly Blass. Lily Parikh manages our Instagram. Our image editor is Talha Khan. Joy Stucker does our website episode updates. And our webmaster is Stalianos Dimitriou. And if you want to have a coaching session with Lisa, Linda, or me, just text me at 404-664-4340. If you have a question you want us to answer, or if you have a recommended resource or article you think we should discuss, just send it to questions@yourcollegeboundkid.com. Our favorite method is for you to record your own voice at speakpipe.com/YCBK. By the way, check out our website, where you'll find lots of content that is not on any podcast app. Our website is yourcollegeboundkid.com. If you want to learn about other hot admissions topics, follow us on Twitter at YCBK Podcasts. We think of you as our listening family, and we look forward to meeting again with you every single Monday and Thursday.